The morning at Chicago O'Hare International Airport began the way most winter mornings began at the first-class gate, with a polished silence that money had been buying for decades. Thin snow drifted across the runway beyond the tall windows. The white light bounced off the marble floor in soft, even waves. Travelers in cashmere coats stood in a quiet line. Adelaide Monroe, 76, stepped into it, almost unnoticed. Charcoal coat, worn smooth at the cuffs, scuffed leather suitcase rolling behind her. Behind the counter, Marlene Tate watched her. At the back of the line, a broad-shouldered black man in a gray flannel shirt stood very still. Marlene Tate was 31 years old. She had been working the premium boarding desk at North Star Airways for almost 6 years. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a low, tight knot. Her navy uniform was pressed sharp at every seam. She had been trained to read passengers in a single glance, and her glance at Adelaide took less than 2 seconds. She saw the worn charcoal coat. She saw the scuffed suitcase. She saw the soft leather shoes with the toes gone pale from years of walking. She saw the absence of every signal she had been taught to recognize as wealth. The verdict was already written before Adelaide had crossed the velvet rope. She stepped out from behind the counter and planted herself directly in the old woman's path. Her smile was the one she used for these moments. Polite at the edges and cold in the middle. Her voice was loud enough to carry to the front of the line. "Ma'am," she said, "this area is reserved for first-class passengers. I'm afraid you may be in the wrong line." Adelaide stopped. She did not look surprised. She looked tired in the patient way that very old women look tired when they have learned, over many decades, that being misjudged is the small daily weather of being alive. She reached into the inner pocket of her coat and drew out the boarding pass. Her fingers trembled very slightly. She held it up between them. "I am not in the wrong line," she said softly. "This is my ticket. This is my seat." Marlene did not glance at the screen behind her to verify it. She did not scan the barcode. She took the ticket between 2 fingers, the way a person handles something they have already decided is suspect, and held it up to the light as though she were reading a forged document. The line behind Adelaide began, quietly, to take notice. A woman in a camel coat tightened her grip on her handbag. A young man in a navy blazer leaned toward his girlfriend and whispered something that made her smile. At the back of the line, Archie Whitman watched the entire exchange in silence. He was 35 years old. He was an aircraft maintenance technician for North Star Airways at this very airport. He had been working the night shift in Hangar 4 for almost 10 years. And he could close his eyes and tell which engine was running by the sound of it alone. He was wearing the gray flannel shirt because he had taken 3 days of personal leave to fly to Boston for the funeral of the older mechanic who had trained him as a teenager. He was flying first class for the first time in his life because the older mechanic's widow had insisted on covering the upgrade as a thank you. He had almost refused the gift. He had almost worn his good jacket. In the end, he had worn the flannel because the older mechanic had always worn flannel. He recognized Marlene. She had walked past Hangar 4 many times on her way to the employee lot. He had nodded at her every single time. She had never, in 3 years, nodded back. He had stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing the cold. Now he watched her hold the old woman's ticket between 2 fingers, and he understood with a kind of quiet sickness exactly what was about to happen because he had seen this same small play performed 100 different times in 100 different counters in 100 different parts of this country, and the ending was always the same. Marlene turned the boarding pass over in her hand as though looking for a watermark. "And where did you purchase this, ma'am?" she asked. Her voice was very polite. "Was it bought on your behalf? Are you certain you have not taken someone else's ticket by mistake?" Adelaide opened the small leather wallet inside her coat and offered her driver's license without looking up. Her voice, when it came, was so soft that the people closest to her had to lean in to hear it. "My name is Adelaide Monroe," she said. "I purchased the ticket myself. I am flying to New York on a personal trip." She paused, and her eyes flickered down to the suitcase by her side, as though drawing a small breath from it. "Today is a special day. It is the 50th anniversary of my wedding. My husband promised me many years ago That he would take me to New York in a first-class seat. He promised we would walk through Central Park while the snow was falling. He passed away before he could keep that promise. I am making the trip myself, with the suitcase we shared on every journey of our lives together. In another life, in another moment, that story would have stopped a woman like Marlene mid-breath, but Marlene only tilted her head, the way someone tilts their head when a story is a small inconvenience to be processed and set aside. She gave Adelaide a slow, performative smile that made sure the rest of the line was watching. "Ma'am," she said, loud enough to carry, "I am very sorry for your loss. But a sad story does not prove that you belong in the first-class cabin." It landed the way a slap lands. Adelaide flinched once, almost imperceptibly. A woman near the velvet rope laughed and then quickly covered her mouth as though she had not meant to. A businessman in a cashmere scarf made a small, approving sound. Marlene felt the attention bend toward her, and she mistook it, the way people in uniforms often do, for approval. What she did not see was Adelaide's reaction. The old woman did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She drew the suitcase a little closer to her hip and rested her hand on the worn handle, the way a person rests their hand on the shoulder of someone they love. Her thumb moved once across the leather, very softly. She was not gripping it for stability. She was holding it the way you hold the last living thing you have left. Archie Whitman saw it. He saw the trembling fingers, and then he saw, almost without meaning to, the small initials carved into the leather, just beneath the brass handle. The letters were old, browned, half-worn by time. A, M, and E, M, joined by a small ampersand, the way a wedding ring joins two names. Something moved in his chest that he had not expected. When he was 9, his mother had kept an old leather sewing kit on the top shelf of her closet. She had carried it home from the last family she had worked for as a private nurse, a wealthy household up in Lake Forest where she had cared for a dying man for almost 7 years. She had never spoken much about that family. She had only said once that the wife of the man she nursed had been the kindest white woman she had ever met. The sewing kit had 2 initials burned into the underside of the lid in the same old-fashioned style. He could not remember now exactly which letters they had been, but he remembered the shape of the ampersand, and he remembered the way his mother had touched the lid of that box every time she passed the closet. He looked at the old woman holding her suitcase. He looked at her trembling hand. He looked at the line of cashmere coats laughing softly behind her. And then he stepped out of the line. He did not move quickly. He did not raise his voice. He walked the way a man walks who has spent a lifetime learning that calm is its own kind of strength. He passed 2 travelers, passed the velvet rope, and stopped beside Adelaide, close enough that she could feel another presence beside her in the cold marble air. She did not look at him. She only tightened her hand on the handle of the suitcase, very slightly, as though steadying herself against the warmth of another body she had not expected. Archie turned to Marlene. His voice, when it came, was quiet and even. "Your job," he said, "is to check the ticket. It is not to check her worth through her coat." The entire boarding area went still for a second. Marlene's smile did not disappear. It only sharpened. She turned her head slowly and let her eyes travel down the gray flannel shirt, past the dark jeans, down to the leather shoes he had polished the night before. She let the silence stretch long enough that the line could feel it. Then she spoke, and she made sure her voice reached the velvet rope. "Sir," she said, with the same polished voice she had used on Adelaide, "are you also a first-class passenger? Or did you come to the wrong gate?" A small, polite laugh came from somewhere behind Archie. He did not turn his head to find it. He only drew his own boarding pass out of his shirt pocket and laid it gently on the counter, face up. Cabin A, row 2, window seat. His name printed in clean black letters, Archie Whitman. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. Marlene's eyes moved to the ticket, then back to his face. Something in her jaw tightened, but her smile did not break. She did not pick the ticket up. She did not scan it. She did not so much as touch the paper. She let it lie on the counter between them, like a thing she had been asked to identify, and was choosing, deliberately, not to acknowledge. The young man in the navy blazer behind Archie shifted on his feet. The woman with the camel coat looked down at her shoes. The businessman with the cashmere scarf cleared his throat once and did not look up. Even the man with the upside-down newspaper had stopped pretending to read. The whole quiet line had become a row of bowed heads, and not one of them had spoken a single word in defense of the woman on the bench beside her suitcase. Adelaide turned her head, very slightly, and looked up at the tall man standing beside her, and for the first time that morning, her shoulders dropped a quarter of an inch. It was not relief. It was something older than relief. It was the small, quiet shock of being seen by a stranger when you had stopped expecting it. Her lips moved, but no sound came out, only a soft tightening at the corners of her mouth that might, in another life, have been the beginning of a smile. She let her hand rest very lightly against the cuff of his flannel sleeve for one single second, the way an old woman thanks a man without using any words at all. Marlene began to talk. She talked about the integrity of the premium cabin experience. She talked about the airline's responsibility to its loyal customers. She used the word procedure 3 times in the space of 1 minute, and each time the word came out a little louder, as though volume could turn a personal insult into a policy. She told Adelaide that there were verification protocols. She told Archie that there were standards of conduct in the premium boarding area. She built a small, careful wall of polished words around herself, and she stood inside it the way a child stands inside a fort. Archie listened to her until she stopped. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice. When she finally paused for breath, he answered her in the same quiet tone he had used before. "You are not protecting any passenger," he said. "You are protecting your own pride." Several travelers in the line looked down at their shoes. The young man with the phone lowered it slowly. The businessman with the upside-down newspaper finally turned it right side up, but did not pretend to read it anymore. Marlene's mouth opened and closed once. Her cheeks had begun to flush. Adelaide turned her head slightly toward Archie. Her voice was almost too soft to hear. "Young man," she said, "you do not have to do this for me." Archie looked down at her. Up close, he could see the fine network of lines around her eyes, the careful pearl in each ear, the small gold band on her left hand that had thinned with 60 years of wearing. He could see the way her shoulders curved slightly forward, as though she were used to making herself small for other people's comfort. He thought, for one strange and steady second, about his daughter. Naomi was 7 years old. She was at home in his father's small house on the south side, where she stayed when Archie worked the night shift. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw. She had recently begun asking him questions at bedtime that he did not always know how to answer. She had asked him, 2 weeks ago, why a woman at the grocery store had watched her so closely while she chose an apple. She had asked him, last week, why the new boy at school had told her his mother said her hair looked like a problem. He had stayed up late that night, sitting on the edge of her bed long after she had fallen asleep, trying to think of an answer he could live with. He had not been able to find one. He looked at Adelaide. He answered her, and the answer was not really for her at all. "Ma'am," he said, "I am not doing this because you are rich or poor. I am doing this because one day my little girl may be the one standing alone, and I hope that when that day comes, someone will speak a fair word for her. So I am going to be the kind of man who speaks the fair word now." Adelaide closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were wet. She did not thank him. She only nodded, very slowly. The way a person nods when a debt they did not know they were carrying has just been lifted from their shoulders. Her fingers found the worn handle of the suitcase again, and this time her thumb did not move in a small frightened circle. It rested there, still, the way a hand rests on a doorframe when a long walk is finally over. Marlene heard him. She had been waiting for an opening, and what she heard instead was a sentence that did not give her one. So she did what people do when they have lost the high ground and refused to step down from it. She reached for the lowest path that was still open to her. She looked Archie up and down one more time. She made sure the line was watching, and then she said it. "Sir," she said, "I don't know how someone like you got a first-class ticket this morning, but this isn't a stage. Maybe you should go back to the seats in the rear of the aircraft where you belong. and let me do my job." The words landed on the marble like a stone. For a long second, no one spoke. A young black woman near the end of the line, who had been quietly listening from behind her boyfriend's shoulder, lifted her head. Her eyes filled. She had heard that sentence before. Her grandmother had heard it. Her mother had heard it. She had heard it herself at 16 in a department store in Atlanta. She had heard it at 22 in a restaurant in Street Louis. She had not expected to hear it again at an airport gate in Chicago on a Tuesday morning in winter. But there it was, the same old sentence, dressed up in a North Star Airways uniform and a polished smile. Archie did not raise his voice. He did not step closer. He only looked at Marlene for a long, steady moment, the way a man looks at a piece of broken equipment when he is trying to decide whether it can be repaired. "Ma'am," he said, "are you sure you're talking about my ticket, or are you talking about my skin?" The boarding area went perfectly still. Marlene swallowed hard. Her mouth opened. She tried to find a word that would walk her back across the line she had just crossed, but the line had closed behind her, and there were no words on the other side. The businessman lowered the newspaper entirely. The woman with a camel coat let go of her handbag. The young black woman at the end of the line pressed her hand against her boyfriend's wrist and did not look away from Archie's face. Adelaide Monroe raised her head. For the first time all morning, she looked directly into Marlene's eyes. Her gaze was not soft. It was not the gaze of an elderly woman being protected. It was the gaze of a woman who had run a company for 40 years and had learned, somewhere along the way, exactly how to look at a person who needed to remember they were being seen. "Young woman," Adelaide said quietly, "I would like you to answer his question." The seconds stretched. The line did not move. Somewhere far down the corridor, the boarding announcement for another flight murmured through a speaker and faded into nothing. Marlene's hand tightened around the edge of the counter. The polished smile she had been wearing since the morning began was gone now. What was left was a face that did not yet know what shape it was supposed to make. The young black woman at the end of the line tightened her grip on her boyfriend's sleeve. The boy in the navy blazer who had laughed earlier had not laughed for a long time. The woman who had clutched her handbag had let it slide down to her elbow and was no longer guarding it from anyone. The cold marble air of the boarding gate had begun to feel very heavy, the way a room feels heavy when someone has finally named the thing the room has been pretending all morning not to see. Marlene did not answer. She did what people do when they are caught and unwilling to admit it. She turned her head away and waved her hand sharply down the corridor. 2 airport security officers in dark uniforms had been standing near the next gate. They turned and began walking toward the first-class boarding area at a measured pace. The older of the two, a heavy-set man in his 50s, reached the counter first. Marlene began speaking before he had fully stopped walking, the way a person speaks who knows that the first version of the story is the one that sticks. She told him there was an irregularity. She told him an elderly passenger had presented a ticket with unclear ownership. She told him the passenger had refused to step aside for verification. She told him an older male passenger had inserted himself into the situation and was now obstructing the boarding process. She did not say the words she had actually used. She did not say poor. She did not say back of the aircraft. She said irregularity. She said verification. She said obstruction. The language did the work that her thoughts had been doing all along. The officer looked at Adelaide. Adelaide had begun to look unwell. Her face had gone the color of old paper. Her hand had risen to the center of her chest. Her breathing had become shallow and uneven. Archie saw it before anyone else did. He moved very quickly, in the careful way a man moves when he has spent years around equipment that can fail in a single second, and put his hand under her elbow to steady her. "Sit down, ma'am," he said gently. "Right here. I have you." He guided her to the small upholstered bench beside the counter. She lowered herself onto it slowly. He kept his hand under her elbow the whole way, and only let go when she had settled. He looked up at the older officer. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer quiet. It was steady, but it carried. "Officer," he said, "all you need to do is scan that ticket. It will take 3 seconds. Please do not let her hurry become a stain on the rest of this woman's life." The officer hesitated. Something about the man in the flannel shirt reached him in a way that uniforms usually did not. He glanced at the screen behind Marlene. He took half a step toward the counter. Marlene began to speak again, faster now, about the delay to other passengers, about the responsibility that would fall on him if the boarding fell behind schedule. But the officer was no longer listening to her. He had already reached for the boarding pass. It was at that exact moment that a new voice cut across the boarding area from the long marble corridor that led from the medical office wing. "Marlene, what are you doing here?" The voice was a woman's voice, middle-aged, low and clear. It carried the particular tone of a mother who has just walked into a room and discovered that her child is doing something she did not raise her to do. The older security officer paused with his hand halfway to the boarding pass. Marlene froze. For a single second, all the practiced authority in her voice drained out of her, and what was left underneath was the face of a daughter who had just heard her name spoken in a way she had not been called since she was a child. She turned her head slowly toward the corridor, and the boarding pass she had been holding all morning slipped a quarter of an inch in her fingers before she caught it again. Every head in the boarding area turned. A woman in her mid-50s was walking quickly down the corridor toward the gate. Her hair was salt and pepper, cut short and neat at the jaw. She wore a gray wool coat over a soft cream sweater, and she carried a small white paper bag with a pharmacy logo printed on the side. Her name tag, half hidden by the collar of her coat, read Delphine Tate, RN. She had been working a private home care shift uptown that morning. She had stopped at the airport medical office on her way home because her own blood pressure prescription had been transferred to the pharmacy there. She had not expected to come anywhere near the first-class boarding area. She had seen the back of her daughter's blonde head from across the corridor, and she had thought, for one warm second, what a nice surprise. And then she had seen the older woman on the bench. She stopped walking. The paper bag slid from her hand and hit the marble with a small, soft sound. The pharmacy bottle inside rolled half an inch and stopped. Delphine Tate did not speak again right away. She crossed the rest of the boarding area in 7 quick steps, and she went past her daughter as though her daughter were not standing there. She knelt down beside the bench. She took the old woman's hand in both of her own. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper that the entire line heard anyway. "Mrs. Monroe," she said. "Mrs. Monroe, are you all right? What are you doing here by yourself? Why didn't you call the car?" Adelaide Monroe opened her eyes. She looked at the salt and pepper hair, at the worried, lined face, at the warm hands holding her own, and she smiled, very faintly. It was the first time she had smiled all morning. "Delphine," she said, "I wanted to go alone. Today is 50 years. Delphine made a small sound in her throat, half a breath and half a sob, and squeezed the old woman's hand. Then she stood up slowly. She did not let go of Adelaide's hand. She turned toward the counter. She turned toward her daughter. The expression that crossed her face was not anger. Anger would have been easier to look at. It was the look of a mother who had just understood, in one single second, that the entire shape of her life had been bent by something she did not see coming. "Marlene," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Marlene, what did you just do to this woman?" Marlene's face had gone white. She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked at her mother. She looked at the woman on the bench. She looked at the badge clipped to her own uniform. "Mom," she whispered. "Mom, who is she?" Delphine looked at her for a long moment. "She paid for your college," Delphine said, "every semester. For 4 years. When your father was sick and we had nothing, she paid for it and asked me never to tell you. She nursed her own husband through 6 years of dying with me sitting at his bedside. And when he passed, she made sure my daughter could finish her degree. I never told you because I did not want you to feel that you owed anyone. I did not know I was raising you into a woman who would treat the person who raised you like that." The silence that followed had weight. It was the silence of 100 small assumptions collapsing all at once. The boarding area, which had been holding its breath, did not exhale. Marlene stared at her mother as though she had never truly looked at her before, as though the woman in the gray wool coat had been a stranger to her for 28 years and only become visible in this one terrible second. It was at that moment That footsteps came from the long marble hallway that led to the executive office wing. They were quick, controlled, the kind of footsteps that men in tailored suits make when they have been told to hurry without losing their dignity. 3 men in dark suits came forward in a careful formation. The man at the front carried a slim leather folio. He did not look at Marlene. He did not look at the security officers. He walked past all of them as though they were columns of air, and he stopped in front of Adelaide Monroe, and he gave her a small, formal bow. "Mrs. Monroe," he said, "forgive the delay. Your assistant alerted us when you did not board on time. The shareholder communications are ready according to your instructions." Marlene's head turned very slowly. The attorney straightened. He looked at the older security officer. He looked at Marlene. His voice was even and calm and very loud in the silent room. "This is Mrs. Adelaide Monroe," he said, "founder of Monroe Capital Trust, largest individual shareholder of North Star Airways, one of the wealthiest women in the state of Illinois." The line did not move. The young man with the phone slowly lowered it to his side. The woman who had laughed turned her face away and pressed her hand against her cheek. The businessman with the cashmere scarf set down his briefcase as though it had become too heavy to hold. Marlene's face went a particular shade of white that comes only when a person has already understood, in full, what they have just lost. She leaned back against the counter. Her hand groped behind her for the edge of it, and found it, and held on. Adelaide reached out and took her boarding pass back from Marlene's hand. Her fingers no longer trembled. She rose slowly from the bench. Delphine kept one hand under her arm to steady her, but the steadying was no longer about the body. It was about the dignity that had been kept waiting too long. Adelaide turned to face Marlene. She did not raise her voice. She had not raised her voice in 50 years of building Monroe Capital Trust. The polished words she had used in every boardroom of her life were the same words she chose now, but here they did not protect anyone. Here they only stripped the room down to its true shape. "You did not doubt my ticket," Adelaide said. "You doubted my dignity, because I did not look like the kind of person you wanted to serve." Marlene's mouth opened. No sound came out. "And then," Adelaide said, "you said it out loud to the man standing next to me. You used the same tone of voice that the generation before mine used, the tone I have spent my entire life teaching my children and my grandchildren never to use again. I heard it. He heard it. Your mother heard it. The young woman at the back of the line heard it. And I want you to look at her, please, before you say anything else." Marlene turned her head. The young black woman at the back of the line did not look away. Her boyfriend stood very still beside her. They did not speak. They did not need to. "I do not want an apology this morning," Adelaide said. "I want to know how many people without my name, without my attorney, and without my shares in this airline have stood at this counter and heard that sentence from you. And I want you to know that I am going to find out, because the woman at the back of the line who heard you say it is going to remember it for the rest of her life. And I am going to make sure that what she remembers next is the part where someone made it right." A senior representative of North Star Airways had reached the gate by now, breathless, with 2 assistants behind him. He began at once to apologize. He used the words airlines use when they have something to lose. He said the airline would investigate internally. He said Mrs. Monroe would receive every possible courtesy. Adelaide listened to him for a moment, and then quietly cut his sentence in half. "I am not the only person who needed a fair word at this counter this morning," she said. "Stop talking to me about my ticket. Start talking to me about every passenger you have ever let walk away from this gate feeling smaller than they were." Marlene's badge was taken from her chest before the boarding had resumed. The senior representative did not ask her to step aside. He asked her to step away. She lowered herself onto the upholstered bench Adelaide had just left. She did not cry yet. She sat with her hands open in her lap, palms up, the way a child sits when she has been told to wait for a punishment she does not yet understand the size of. Delphine knelt down in front of her daughter. She did not embrace her. She did not scold her. She put both of her hands over her daughter's hands and held them there. "I did not tell you who she was," Delphine said softly, "because I was afraid you would learn to bow. I did not know I was raising you to stand straight in front of poor people and bow in front of rich ones. That is on me too. I should have told you the whole story. I should have told you that the woman who paid for your books wore the same coat every winter for 30 years because her husband gave it to her the year they got engaged. I should have told you that the richest woman I have ever known opened her door to me at 4 in the morning when my husband was dying and made me a pot of coffee with her own hands. I thought I was protecting your pride. I was starving your heart. Marlene began to cry. She did not cry loudly. She cried the way grown women cry when they have just discovered a version of themselves they did not know they had become. She raised her head. She looked at Adelaide, who was watching her quietly from a few feet away. She looked at Archie, who had not moved from his place beside the bench, and the first words she said, when the crying allowed her to speak, were not for the woman with the suitcase. They were for the man in the flannel shirt. "I'm sorry," she said. Her voice broke on the word. "I said that to you. I can't take it back. I will never forget that I said it." Archie looked at her for a long moment. He did not smile. He did not soften. He nodded once, slowly. "I don't need you to apologize to me," he said. "I need you to remember the face of the next person you almost say it to." The boarding resumed. The line moved forward in a quieter way than it had moved before. The businessman put away his newspaper. The woman with the camel coat folded her hands very carefully in front of her. The young black woman at the back of the line caught Archie's eye as he walked past her, and she did not say anything, but she nodded, and he nodded back, and a small thing passed between them that no one else in the corridor would have understood. Adelaide reached for the worn handle of her suitcase. Archie reached for it first, gently, and took it without asking. She did not protest. They walked toward the jet bridge together, the old woman in the charcoal coat and the tall man in the gray flannel shirt. And behind them on the bench, her mother held Marlene's hands and did not let go. Adelaide asked Archie to sit beside her in the first-class cabin. He did. Delphine stayed at the gate with her daughter. The plane pushed back from the jetway on time. When the cabin had settled and the engines had begun their long, steady warm-up, Adelaide turned in her seat and looked at the man beside her. She told him about Edmund. She told him about a small coffee shop near the train station in the first year of their marriage, when they had been so poor that they shared a single cup of coffee between them and argued gently, every morning, about who would take the last sip. She told him that Edmund had once said to her, with his forehead pressed to hers across the table, that one day he was going to take her to New York in a first-class seat. For Edmund, she said, first class had never meant a wider chair. It had meant the day she would be respected. Archie listened with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the snow drifting past the small oval window. When she finished, he told her, very softly, about his daughter. Her name was Naomi, he said. She was 7 years old. She lived with him and her grandfather in a small house on the south side. Her mother had passed 3 years ago. He told her about the questions Naomi had begun to ask at bedtime, and the answers he did not always know how to give. Adelaide reached across the armrest and put her hand over his. She did not speak for a long time. In the weeks that followed, North Star Airways announced a complete overhaul of its premium service training. A confidential complaint line was established for passengers who had experienced discriminatory service. The internal investigation found 17 previous complaints that had been quietly closed. Marlene Tate was not prosecuted. She entered the new training program that Adelaide Monroe personally funded the following spring, and 1 year later she became one of the first staff instructors. She told the story of that morning at the beginning of every session. Delphine flew with Adelaide to New York the following winter. The two of them walked through Central Park together while the snow was falling, an old nurse and an old widow, arm in arm. That night, when Archie came home, he sat on the edge of Naomi's bed and told her, in the simplest words he could find, that he had met a very old woman at the airport that morning, who had spent her whole life being underestimated, and that she had taught him something he wanted Naomi to remember. He told her that the richest person in any room is never the one with the most money. The richest person is the one who refuses to let anyone stand alone on the worst morning of their life. Naomi listened, very seriously, the way she listened when she knew something mattered. Then she asked him what the old woman had been carrying. He told her, a suitcase with 2 letters carved under the handle, joined by a small ampersand. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she kissed his cheek and went to sleep with her small hand curled around his thumb, the way she had slept every night since she was very small. A first-class ticket can be bought with money, but stepping out of a quiet line for a stranger on a cold morning, with no idea who she is, cannot be bought and cannot be given. That morning at Chicago O'Hare, Archie Whitman did not prove that he deserved his seat. He proved that there are people who, simply by walking into a room, make the room a more honorable place to stand in.